How many minutes do you have?
Till 3.
Okay. Good afternoon. We're very pleased to have you here for this briefing by the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, who soon will be our ambassador to Indonesia. It's also his last appearance with us in his capacity as Assistant Secretary, and so he'll take this occasion to take you on a tour of his area. Our briefer today is Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz. Mr. Ambassador.
Nice to be here. I just learned a bit of new, I guess it's Pentagon slang today. A friend of mine called up and said, "Oh, you're leaving tomorrow." He said, "That really makes you short," as in, short timer. In fact, around here we'd say, "You're so short you can shower in the sink." I really am, and I'm not entirely certain why I'm here, because I've not only stopped keeping up with a lot of important things in the last few days, but I've probably already begun forgetting things that I should know. But I'm told it's a tradition for assistant secretaries to do a briefing like this when they're leaving my job, and I believe in traditions, and especially traditions when it comes to our dealing with the press corps, which I think is a very important part of the job. So if only for that reason, I'm happy to be here. I'm also happy to be here to have a chance to say thank you to you, and I might also say to your colleagues in the State Department press corps and the White House press corps. I've enjoyed in the last 3 years dealing with the press. I think at times, as you won't surprise you, government officials don't always look kindly on the press, but I think in fact it's been a good relationship. I think we have benefited in fact in our policy in Asia from having good and effective press coverage. It was in a sense most evident during the dramatic weekend before last in the Philippines, when I think, as everyone has noticed, several of the most important U.S. policy actions were press statements. I think that's a comment on the role and relationship of the press and the government, and it goes, of course, way beyond that. I guess it's also an occasion to express my thanks to the many foreign government officials who have dealt with me over the last 3 years, always patiently, usually with great resources of information, of knowledge, of experience. I've learned an enormous amount in this job, and it's something I will be grateful for a long time to come. And finally, and this is by no means exhausts my list of thank yous, but I know you want to ask some questions, so I won't try to be complete. But I have to say a word or two about the President and the Secretary of State, because I feel I've been unusually privileged as Assistant Secretary for East Asia in having at the top of the State Department and the top of the U.S. government two men who had such a deep appreciation of the importance of Asia to the United States, and I think also such a deep appreciation of the achievements of the individual Asian countries and of, one might say, the Pacific Basin countries as a group, and such a commitment to playing America's proper role in cultivating our relationship with the nations of the Pacific and helping them to help themselves to build a Pacific Basin region that is more prosperous, more stable, has a brighter future, I think, even than 3 years ago. And those of you who heard my pep talk 3 years ago know that I'm one of the boosters. I think it's a region that has an enormous amount going for it. I think the economic record continues to dazzle everybody. I think the way that we have worked with our friends in Asia to deal with some very difficult trade and economic problems over the last 3 years does credit to people on both sides of the Pacific. Those problems are very much still with us, and they're not always, can't say that every result is a good one. I'm sure you're going to have some questions for me about outstanding problems, but I think the record of problems solved is an impressive one to build on. I think the commitment by the President and by the Secretary to building confidence in the United States as a country that our friends can depend on, and our adversaries will at least know where we stand. I think that is an important record. I think it's been important not just to our allies in Asia, but to many friendly non-aligned countries as well. And I could try to tick off various areas where I think we have had successes. Maybe I'll let you fill that in for me, but I think there are many. I think our relations with the two big countries of Northeast Asia, with China and Japan, were good when I started in this job, I think are even stronger today. And I give the President and the Secretary the lion's share of the credit for that on our side. I think that we have been seeing some very promising developments on the Korean Peninsula, both in dealings between North and South Korea, and also despite some steps that aren't always forward, I still think the basic trend on political development in Korea is a promising one and a hopeful one, as it must be, since that remains, I think, a major, important question mark and problem for the future. I feel that we in the countries of Southeast Asia have deepened our cooperation over the last 3 years. I know Secretary of State is deeply committed to working with ASEAN and deeply impressed by the record of the ASEAN countries. They're kind of a model of regional cooperation, and when we talk about regionalism in this government, when we talk about trying to get countries of a region to work together on common problems, ASEAN is usually trotted out as the model of how successful that can be. Of course, one of the biggest problems that we still continue to face, and I guess judging from the record is going to be with us for some time to come, is the continuing tragedy in Cambodia, which still today seems no closer to a political solution than it was 3 years ago. But I think that the record of the ASEAN countries and their supporters in the West must be starting to have an effect on Vietnam, and must be starting to persuade Vietnam that this is not a problem that will simply go away by waiting everybody else out. And I think that ultimately will be the beginning of a solution, if and when it happens. I think we have been through a very interesting period in the last few years in U.S.-Australian relations. I think it's testimony to the strength of that relationship and to the quality of the new Labour government in Australia that despite a major change in government in Australia, we have continued with a strong alliance relationship intact. Of course, the question of port access in New Zealand remains unsolved. I think it is something I regret. I think we will continue working at it. I hope that it can be solved, because even though New Zealand is very small and very far away, that is an alliance that is important to us and one that we put a very high value on. The last few weeks have been dominated by news from the Philippines, and certainly what's happened there is a dramatic achievement for the Philippine people. I think if we've had a good policy toward the Philippines in the last 2 years, and I believe we have, the central premise of that policy has been that if solutions are to emerge and be viable, they have to be Filipino solutions, and that it's important for us to help in every way we can. It's important for us to use our influence as much as it can be effective, but it's important above all to realize that it's not the United States that can impose or dictate solutions, it's the Filipinos themselves. And I think the record in the last few months is a most extraordinary one. I'd emphasize that it is not the end of the story, it's in a sense the beginning. It is a most hopeful beginning, but the new government in the Philippines still faces formidable problems, economic problems, security problems, and political ones. And I can say with very great conviction, speaking not just for myself, but for the entire U.S. government, that they can count on our help in facing those problems, as we have tried to help to the maximum of our ability in the last few years. I guess I would just conclude by a few words about how excited I am at my new job. Some of you may know, those of you who don't know, Indonesia is a family interest for me. My wife has been a student of Indonesian and Javanese for a long time. This is something not in quite this specific form we have looked forward to for a very long time. It's a fascinating country. It's a terribly important country. the 5th largest country in the world, and of course the largest Muslim population of any country in the world. An extraordinary leadership role in Southeast Asia in the non-aligned movement, and I think a very good relationship with the United States, which I hope that I can help to preserve and indeed strengthen during my time there. With that, I guess I will try to take questions, but not about Mr. Marcos's assets, please. I'm not current.
Committed to start over here, right back there. Right here.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for allowing me the first question. My name is Kwak. I'm from the MBC television in Seoul, South Korea. Secretary Schultz observed in a written statement submitted to the Congress that tension on the Korean peninsula remains still high, and the continued American sports are crucial, especially during the period of 3 years up to the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. Could you explain your observation on the Korean situation in more detail?
I think in Korea we have a truly extraordinary record of achievement, particularly economic achievement. It's captured the attention of the whole world. It's even beginning to capture the attention of American automobile consumers. It's not always the attention maybe Koreans want to have, but for the most part it is admiration. And I think along with that is a very impressive record of increasing self-reliance in the security field. Not that the American commitment doesn't remain crucial to the security of Korea, but more and more Korea is taking over a larger and larger role in providing its own security. I think the two areas where the most remains to be done are in the area of improving relations with North Korea, and I don't think there's a lot more that one can do than has been done until there's some basic change in attitude from the North. I think, in fact, the South Korean government has conducted its diplomacy toward North Korea in the last few years with extraordinary skill. I think all the more when you consider the tragedy of the Rangoon bombing, which is barely 2 years old, and yet even in the wake of that, I think there have been some modest but important diplomatic advances. But the area that I think remains the most important one and the most difficult one is the, whatever word one chooses to call it, the political development of Korea. And I think there have been some very promising steps in a positive direction, particularly the parliamentary elections of last year, which I think were extraordinary for the degree of free and open political competition that they permitted. There are a lot of problems to work out. It isn't always easy working out problems like this. We've seen some hiccups in the last month or so, but I think, in fact, the meeting between President Chun and opposition leader Lee Min-woo just a few days ago, about a week ago, suggests that even those problems perhaps are being surmounted in a spirit of moderation and accommodation. And those accommodations and compromises have to be worked out by Koreans. They can't be dictated by Americans, and they certainly shouldn't be dictated by the U.S. government. But they are very important to the United States. I think the long-term security of Korea, in which we have such a huge stake, will be advanced enormously if the long-term political stability of Korea can be assured. And while democracy, to some people, perhaps doesn't always look like the most stable political system, after all, we change our leaders all the time, we have all sorts of tumultuous debate and criticism, I think the record shows that all of that accommodation of change actually makes it the most stable and strongest system in the long run. And I think the kind of evolution that Korea is trying to undertake, and particularly the peaceful transition of power in 1988 that President Chun has committed himself to, are very important steps on the road to a development that will benefit not just the Korean people, but all of their friends in the Pacific Basin.
May I just follow up on the same area? That I'd like to phrase the question in different context. I'd like to know what is the State Department assessment of the political situation in Korea, since I have seen many editorials and newspaper articles here in this country siding sometimes frequently with the South Korean opposition leaders, has been equating the situation in Korea to the Philippines drama. I wonder whether the U.S. government is also backing the South Korean opposition parties as it has done in the Philippines. If the State Department is viewing the realities of the Korea is different from the South Korea, how different is it in your official point of view?
You're not going to get a lot of answer from me on that. But let me first of all say, and I don't want to, in saying so, cause any problems with President Aquino, whom I've known for now a couple of years and admire. We weren't backing the opposition in the Philippines. We were backing the development of democratic institutions. We were backing reforms. We felt it was very important, and it's important, I think, in all cases for the United States to keep neutrality as to the question of who the leaders are that a people chooses for themselves. I think at the same time that we say that, we can be equally strong about our commitment to democratic processes, to free and fair elections. In the case of the Philippines, to some fundamental military and economic reforms that were overdue. But every country is unique in its historical traditions, in the aspirations of the people, in the character of individual leaders, and in the kinds of problems that they face. And I think it's fascinating to try to draw the lessons of the Philippines. We had a lot of lessons that were being thrown in my face during the last 2 years that we were supposed to apply to the Philippines, and most of them didn't apply there. I think looking at history can help you ask some of the right questions about a new situation, but I don't think it gives you any formulas about how to proceed in circumstances that in all cases are very, very different.
Connie on.
Thank you. So many angry words have been exchanged between New Zealand and the United States in the past year. I have 3 questions. Is there anything the U.S. could have done differently to prevent this rift? What do you see as the future of the ANZUS relationship after the anti-nuclear legislation becomes law? And do you expect the United States to sign the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty?
I don't think, certainly from our side, that the words have been angry ones. I think the spirit is more one of sorrow than of anger. And I think that it remains very much our interest to see this problem solved. I think we have done everything that we could have done. We've made a number of efforts along the way to try to achieve a compromise, and we will continue to make those efforts. But there are limits on how far we can go, and we have one Navy. It has to carry out a wide variety of security roles. We can't have one for New Zealand and another for some other ally and a third for the rest of the world. And so there are distinct limits on how much the United States can do. Lest I contribute to the idea of angry words, I don't think I have to repeat. I think everyone knows what the consequences of enacting the port ban into legislation would be. Our hope would be that we can, before that happens, if it happens, that we can find a solution that will restore normal port access for U.S. ships in New Zealand. I think that's something that would be of benefit not just to the United States and New Zealand, but to the whole region. And I think that, in a sense, this issue has gotten much too caught up in the issue of nuclear weapons. I know in some sense people think, well, that's what it's exactly about. I tend to think that isn't hardly what it's about at all. Indeed, it's hard to imagine a U.S. Navy ship having less to do with the nuclear balance than when it's down in Wellington or in South Pacific somewhere. What we're talking about, I think, is, in a military sense, much more conventional presence, and that it isn't even narrowly military. It is the cooperation among allies of a very broad kind that can help to produce stability. I think we're going to see more of that kind of cooperation between the United States and Australia, Japan, and not just allies but other friends when it comes to helping the new Philippine government face the problems of the Philippines. These relationships, which rest on a certain basis of mutual obligation, go way beyond their narrow military applications, and I think because of the respect in which New Zealand and New Zealanders are held in the United States, and because of the long common traditions, the fact is that when New Zealand is an ally in good standing, New Zealanders have a great deal more influence here, I think, than would normally be the case of a small and distant ally. I remember quite clearly, in fact, and I'll try to get now to the last part of your question, what happened, I guess it was in early 1983, and I was still fairly new in this job, and we had a difficult problem in the United States Senate over getting ratification of the treaties that had been signed with 4 very small South Pacific countries that basically abandoned old U.S. claims to pieces of their territory. And it was the New Zealand ambassador who was perhaps our most effective lobbyist on Capitol Hill in explaining to senators why this treaty was important, why these countries were important, why what we were dealing with served the security interests of our countries. And that's the kind of argument that comes effectively from an ally of long and good standing as New Zealand was at the time. And I think on the question of our approach to the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, for example, New Zealand's voice would be a very strong one now if our relationship were in better condition. And I think that's important. In realizing, I was hesitant as to whether I should say anything about where I thought what we'd done right or where the problems remained to be done. Every time you try a list like this, people say, oh, you left us off the list. There's some very important things that have happened in the South Pacific in the last year or so and with respect to U.S. policy. One of the most important has been the ratification of the Compact of Free Association with the Micronesian states. But a number of other things which to some of you may, if you don't know South Pacific, may not sound all that important, but in fact are potentially, I think, of strategic significance, actually. And that's the progress that we've made on negotiating a regional convention to govern tuna fishing, which has been a major sore point between the United States and a number of South Pacific countries. The adherence by the United States to the South Pacific Environmental Convention that prohibits radioactive dumping in the South Pacific. Our South Pacific consciousness has been raised in the last few years, partly through the intercession of the Australian government, partly through the kinds of things we've been hearing from our friends in ASEAN, as a matter of fact, and partly just from our own perception of the importance of these countries and of the importance of dealing with small problems with small countries before they turn into big ones that can affect the peace of the whole region. And I think certainly that's the spirit in which we will be looking at the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. We understand why nuclear matters are particularly neuralgic ones for people in the South Pacific, and I think we have tried in every way that we can find to be sensitive to those concerns. At the same time, we're going to have to look at this treaty from the point of view of a global posture that we have to maintain.
Akiyama, Tokyo Broadcasting System. My question is about Indonesia. Today, the White House announced officially the visit of the President on the 1st of May. President is going to have a meeting with the President Suharto in Bali. My question is, can we expect any historical speech in Bali from the President Reagan? And the second one is, could you tell us your assessment about the role of Indonesia to solve the problem in China? I mean, the withdrawal in achievement of withdrawal of Vietnamese from Cambodia.
Okay. I could get in trouble not only with the President, but even more with his speechwriters if I try to predict, but it is a historic occasion. It will be the first visit by a United States President to Southeast Asia in 10 years. And it also makes it the first visit by a U.S. President to Southeast Asia since the tragedy of Indochina. So I think it's an important occasion, and you can guess as well as I think the President tends to treat those occasions with some seriousness. Beyond that, I shouldn't predict what he's going to try to say about it. As for Indonesia's role in promoting seeking a political settlement to the Cambodian problem, I think it's been a very important one. Clearly, the contacts by Foreign Minister Mokhtar with Vietnamese Foreign Minister Tak have been one of the chief methods that the ASEAN countries as a whole have used for probing Vietnamese intentions. But I would underscore that it's the ASEAN countries as a whole and that they are working together, and that despite appearances of differences and real differences that they argue out in private, I think the degree of unity among the ASEAN countries is what is really impressive, and what is key to a solution in the long run. I think the Indonesians understand this as well as anybody. If the Vietnamese were ever to come to think that they could split ASEAN or split the ASEAN countries from their friends in Japan or the United States or Western Europe, that's when the hopes of a settlement would simply disappear. And I think the unity of the ASEAN countries has been key here. I think President Suharto's personal commitment to ASEAN unity is a very deep one with very strong historic roots, and I expect it to continue. So I expect Indonesia to continue to play the strong and constructive role that it has been.
Richard Paul from Australian Broadcasting Television. Our Prime Minister is due to meet with President Reagan next month. What plans are there for Australia and the United States to cooperate in tackling the EEC agricultural export problems that we both face, particularly in relation to a common approach at the forthcoming round of the multinational trade negotiations?
Well, I think that's one of the major subjects that the Prime Minister and the President will want to talk about, coordinating strategy, and also trying to make sure that do what we can so that in U.S. efforts to counter what I think is fairly and properly viewed as EC agricultural dumping, we don't end up hurting ourselves and hurting our friends more than the people we're trying to dissuade from that sort of practice. It's a very difficult kind of business once you start into retaliation as a way of solving trade problems. Often you just, the President has often illustrates that point with the story of two men in a boat, and one shoots a hole in the boat. The other one responds by shooting a second hole, and the President says, I don't call that getting tough, I call that getting wet. And to some extent, we are now launched on a course of retaliation. And as I think you know, I mean, by the new agricultural bill and the export enhancement program in that bill, and as I think you know, and it certainly can't be emphasized often enough, when the President signed that bill, as he felt he had to, he made it very clear that there were key parts of that bill, including specifically subsidized agricultural exports, that he had serious reservations about. So I'm sure that that will be another subject of discussion with the Prime Minister, what the chances are of changing that legislation in any serious way in the Congress is something that you need a legislative genius, in fact, to give you the prescription on. But I think our objectives are very, very similar. We would like to see free, unsubsidized trade in agricultural products. We recognize Australia is one of the major exporters of unsubsidized agricultural goods, and we'd like to see that it doesn't get hurt.
Okay.
Do you see a role for ASEAN in helping the new Philippines government?
I think there's a role for every friend of the Philippines to help this new government. Although I think we all ought to realize that their success is going to depend first and foremost on their own efforts. It's not going to, with the right policies, particularly in the economic area where a lot of the problems begin, I think with the right policies, the Philippine economy stands to begin recovery, I think, reasonably rapidly. The right policies are ones that build confidence and that put savings back into the Philippine economy and bring investments back from overseas. Those can be supplemented and helped, though, in very positive ways, I think, by the actions and attitudes of the friends of the Philippines. And in a sense, those actions are important in the first place because they can help to contribute to a climate of confidence. And in the second place, the resources themselves can be important. I think in the case of the ASEAN countries, although each one has to decide for itself, and I know anything that comes close to being an interference in one another's internal affairs, the ASEAN countries will abstain from strongly. But still, I think thoughtful advice is something that is welcome from all quarters, and because some of the ASEAN countries have faced problems not unlike those the Philippines faces today, either in the economic area or the security area or both, I would venture that some of the advice they would get from their colleagues in ASEAN might be more pertinent even than the advice that we may be able to give them from Washington or the Japanese government from Tokyo.
Coming back to Cambodia, Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned in the opening statement something like pressures applied onto Vietnam to get things moving on a political solution to the Cambodian problem. Well, what is the United States going to do in terms of increasing such pressure? Do you see any specific measures that the United States is going to do in this regard?
Well, I think we regularly are in consultation with the ASEAN countries about things that can be done to develop the strategy further, and every year at the ASEAN ministerial meeting there's a particularly intensive consideration given to that. Obviously, the more the non-communist resistance can be strengthened, the more pressure there is, and I think the better chance there is for a satisfactory settlement. But I think it's worth underscoring that a settlement is not going to come about because we are suddenly able to build up unbearable pressure on the Vietnamese. There is no prospect of a military defeat of Vietnam and Cambodia, and I think everyone recognizes that. I think what will bring about a settlement is when Vietnam realizes that the pressures which are there already, which are quite substantial, and include not only the pressure of the non-communist resistance, but the pressure on Vietnam from its nearly complete isolation, from its cutting itself off of most fruitful contact with its ASEAN neighbors, cutting itself off from normal relations with the United States and to a very large extent with Japan and Western Europe as well. When Vietnam realizes that those pressures which exist today are going to continue as long as it continues to occupy Cambodia, I think we will begin to get a rethinking. But as long as Vietnam holds out the illusion, and I think they do, that they will outlast us, they have more patience, everyone else will get tired, and then they'll have their cake and eat it too. As long as that illusion is there won't be a settlement.
Yeah, Mr. Ambassador, what is your assessment on the relations between China and the United States? And my second question is, under what conditions the relations between the two countries can be further improved?
I think the relations between our two countries are in very good shape. I think they're very important to both our countries, and that's why I think we've worked so hard over the years, including the 3 years I've been here, to improve our relations in every way that we could. I think as time has gone by, the breadth of the relationship has expanded. One might say that when we first began a new relationship with People's Republic of China in the early 70s, the main preoccupation on both sides was what people called a strategic one, meaning concern about the Soviet Union. And I think that is still very much there. I think it's still a very important part of the relationship. But we now have a much more comprehensive relationship in which we now have very extensive economic cooperation. We have very extensive cultural exchanges. We have over 10,000 Chinese students in the United States and tens of thousands of Americans who visit China in one capacity or another every year. We have, in the last few years, begun to develop military cooperation with China of a careful, defensive kind, but one that we believe promotes the interests of both countries. I think we're at a stage in our relationship where dramatic breakthroughs are not the way we will make progress, but by steadily building in areas where there's common interest, finding new areas of cooperation, and where there are differences, if we can solve them, and if we can't solve them, at least seek to manage them in a way that they don't become major political problems between our countries. I think that's the approach that both of us have been trying to apply, and I think with considerable success.
Tim Colbatch from the Melbourne Age in Australia. I'd like to follow on the question asked about South Korea when you said that the US was interested in supporting democratic reforms throughout the world. Indonesia has not had free and fair elections as we would know them for more than 30 years, and the democratic infrastructure there, you might say, is pretty weak in terms of free press, freedom to organise political parties and so on. What do you see as the role of the US in trying to foster the democratic process in Indonesia? How would you see the US being able to go about supporting democratic institutions? And secondly, when do you actually take up your position?
Well, I'd say first of all it's important to ask what does the particular country see as the US role, and I think it's quite clear that the Indonesian view of our role is very different from that of two countries who are allies. One of the reasons for being non-aligned is sort of not wanting that kind of close involvement with another country. I think that affects the kind of influence we have. I think it has to affect the kind of way we approach things. The words quiet diplomacy have sometimes been given a bad name, but I think it's been a very important element of our policy everywhere, and I think it clearly applies to a country that feels very proud about the principle that other countries don't interfere. I would point out that whatever problems there are in Indonesia, and obviously there are some, if you compare it to what was there 20 years ago and what might have come if events had taken a different course, it is a country with remarkable tolerance, a great deal of individual freedom. In the political area, I think there are things they need to work out, but I would, and not just because I'm going there to be ambassador, but recognizing the very different traditions and the very different political relationships, particularly emphasize in this case the point I made, they're going to have to work those out for themselves. I will be about as quickly as it's possible to do the many things you have to do before you leave town. I'll be anxious to get to Indonesia at least ahead of our president and as much ahead as possible, but when I have a firm date, I'll give it to the government of Indonesia, and then you can learn from them.
Mr. Wolfowitz, Diane Lee from Chinese TV in Taipei. Could you tell us your opinion on the relationship between the United States and the Republic of China on Taiwan for the past few years, and also your forecast for the future? And secondly, what's your opinion? Do you think the recently proposed U.S. arms sale to China would pose any threat to Taiwan?
Well, as I think you know, but let me emphasize, it can't be emphasized often enough, we have close relations with the people of Taiwan, but they are unofficial, and it is very important. It's part of our commitments with the People's Republic of China when we normalized relations, that is the way in which our relations will be conducted. I think we have, well, let me begin with what the President said, and he didn't just say it here or say it somewhere. He said it when he was in China, that we don't believe in sacrificing old friends to make new ones. And we believe that that relationship, though unofficial, can be strengthened in many ways, and we have worked to strengthen it, I guess, in every way except our trade deficit with Taiwan, which keeps burgeoning, and which we're also trying to make some progress on. I think that we're fully aware of the requirements of U.S. laws. They apply to those relations, and I think we have fully lived up to them. On the matter that you raise about arms sales to China and how they might affect the security situation, not just with respect to people on Taiwan, but I might say more broadly in Asia, we are aware of the concerns about strengthening military capabilities in China, and we are certainly not doing anything that we think would threaten the security of people on Taiwan or of our friends in Southeast Asia. At the same time, China faces a major security threat from the Soviet Union and reinforced by a threat from Vietnam to the south. And there's a great deal that they can do and that we think we can help them with to better meet that threat in a way that doesn't in any sense increase a possible threat to others.
Right.
Mr. Secretary, you just said that you attach very important about the relationship, your unofficial relationships with Taiwan. But you are decreasing your military sales to Taiwan year after year. And you can say something about this?
Well, there have been decreases. They've been gradual. The whole premise on which those decreases have been based has been the premise that the threat, in fact, is a declining one and will continue to decline. If that turns out not to be the case, then obviously one has to reassess it. But that was the basic formulation of the 1982 communique. And I just repeat what I said to the last questioner. We take very seriously the requirements on us to meet Taiwan's defensive needs, and I think we have done so.
We have 5 more minutes, and I have 4 hands, so we have about 1 minute and 15 seconds for each one.
You want me to answer quickly?
Jenny Hewitt from the Sydney Morning Herald. You mentioned that you couldn't really compare the situation in South Korea to the situation in the Philippines. I was just wondering then if you think it's logical to compare the results of what happened in Manila to what the US should do in aiding the Contras in Nicaragua, as some people have suggested.
Like the Secretary of State, don't try to get me to give you a second-hand interpretation. I think that the principle, the concern about democracy is something that remains in every case. And in fact, obviously, we're talking in Nicaragua about something different because we feel it's necessary, in fact, to arm the opposition if they're to have a decent chance. And that's quite a bit different story from the Philippines. What we're worried about in Nicaragua is a totalitarian regime, and the record is simply categorical that no totalitarian regime has ever given way to democracy except through something like an invasion in Grenada. And I think if people genuinely care about democracy and human rights, that ought to worry them. It worries us.
Yeah, George Xiang, United Daily News, Taipei. Mr. Secretary, there were quite a bit of frictions in the Sino-American relations over the issue of Taiwan during the first couple of years of the Reagan administration. Nowadays, the administration officials oftentimes claim that they have managed the issue very well. In retrospect, wonder if you can shed some light with us on what are the major reasons that enable you to make that kind of claim, and for the future, what's your assessment of the situation in that part of the region?
Well, I guess I'd be cautious about making that claim. I think that it remains a significant issue and a point on which there are some very big differences between us. I think that we have perhaps both learned something about the areas in which we can try to accommodate one another and the limits on how we can accommodate one another, and the importance of trying to the best we can to keep it from becoming a big issue. But it remains there until there is a resolution of the issue, and we believe the only proper resolution is one by the Chinese people themselves on both sides of the strait, and one that is accomplished peacefully. Until that happens, and I can't tell you when it happens, it remains, I think, a potential problem in our relationship, and one that can become much bigger sometimes than other times.
Abe, Sankei newspaper, Japan. Prime Minister Nakasone will visit next month here, and what is the big issue between conference on Prime Minister and the President?
Well, we have a great many things to talk about with the government of Japan. It's an incredibly broad relationship. I know that when Secretary Schultz meets with Foreign Minister Abe, we have long agendas of many items, and fortunately, I know my boss is very pleased that he's had the stability of one very able foreign minister to deal with during virtually the whole time that Secretary Schultz has been secretary, because there's so much business to get done that, and we're able to move very quickly. It includes very important, and I imagine a lot of this will be on the agenda when the Prime Minister comes here. I'm going to get to trade and economics, and you know that it's all there, but I guess my point is to say it's not just trade and economics. Japan has a very keen interest in the progress of course, of the arms control negotiations, and particularly negotiations concerning the Soviet intermediate nuclear forces. We have been in some very close consultations with the Japanese before putting forward our most recent proposal, and those have helped in an important way to shape what we put forward, and that kind of discussion we would want to see continue. We had some very useful and, as it turned out, timely discussions with the government of Japan about the situation in the Philippines, and welcome very strongly the statement by the Prime Minister, I believe, in the Diet about Japan's willingness to be helpful to the new government. And I would think that would certainly be a subject for the President and the Prime Minister to discuss. We would like to see Japan continue the trend of increasing its assistance to countries well some distance away from Japan, and now we have a new candidate for the list with Haiti. So there's a lot to talk about, but trade and economics obviously have got to be the biggest concern right now. With the Tokyo summit coming up, with a lot of progress having been made, I think, in the MOS talks, and we're even getting American businessmen coming in saying that they believe progress has been made, with a really dramatic change in the value of the yen that we hope is finally going to begin having some impact, and yet still some deep underlying trade problems between ourselves and Japan and among the 7 industrial countries. So I think we will be talking most of all about the kinds of structural changes that are needed in Japan and in the United States, and the kind of strategy that can be developed approaching the Tokyo summit.
I know there are many, many more questions you'd like to ask, but we're going to take one more, and that's Norman.
Mr. Secretary, Norman Fu with the China Times of Taipei. Now that you're leaving, I hope you'll leave with some words of wisdom with us before you go. When you look back, could you tell us some of the high points in your career as Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, and perhaps some of the disappointments or frustrations? I know that you were not an Asian expert before you came on board as Assistant Secretary for East Asia. So I just wonder, this latter day, can you tell us why Secretary Schultz picked you? And also, you know, another perennial problem which you have been asked about so many times. That is the problem, the differences between Taiwan and China. You always say the U.S. position is for the Chinese themselves to resolve the problem, and also from the U.S. perspective is to manage the problem, to control the problem, control the damage, whatever that might be. So I wonder if you can be a little more candid and depart a little bit from your official line, since this is your last day as Assistant Secretary, whether you have any personal thoughts and views as to how the problem is going to be resolved, because let's face it, both leaderships are on both sides of the strait are getting old. Mr. Deng Xiaoping, 81, and Mr. Jiang Jingguo, 75. So there are going to be changes. So I just wonder whether you can share some of your thoughts, innermost thoughts, with us.
We also got old waiting.
But I think he knew he wasn't going to get much in the way of an answer, so he wanted to get the question on the record, and that's fair enough. No, we really do mean it when, I mean, I know if I could take a very, very different example, I know a lot of people on the Hill felt that when we said the Philippine problem was one for Filipino people to resolve, they just thought this was some kind of an excuse. I think it's a very profound statement about policy, and it doesn't mean that our interests aren't engaged, and it doesn't mean we have nothing to do with it, but it means that if any solution is going to work out, they've got to arrive at it. Now, and it take a totally different situation, and it's always a danger to bring up one context with another. Somebody's going to accuse me now of some analogy here. I didn't mean to draw it. But our interest is in that whatever resolution be a peaceful one. What form that will take, I mean, if you were sitting in an academic seminar, people could conjure up many scenarios. Probably history will be much more imaginative than they are, and whatever finally emerges will be something they never dreamed of. But it's something that Chinese people themselves have to arrive at. And when we use words like manage, we don't mean manage that the United States is going to step in and manage a solution. We mean, to the contrary, we're going to manage the problem by staying out of it ourselves and by sticking to a line which may frustrate you because it's terribly bland and terribly official, but it's not an area for us to start stepping in with creative new formulations. I think we have found the right way of talking about a difficult subject, a way that doesn't, that causes the fewest possible political problems for people, that doesn't embarrass or humiliate anyone, and that's why we approach it in that way. And as to why Secretary Shultz picked me, I guess maybe you can write him a letter, maybe he'll answer. But I'm very grateful that he did.
And so are we. And on that note, we'll end this briefing. We wish the ambassador Godspeed and good luck in his new assignment. Thank you very much. That was very good.